Walk down almost any British high street today. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Coventry, Oxford, or a small market town somewhere in Kent. Between the empty department stores, bedding shops, and phone repair stores, one sign seems to appear again and again. Turkish Barber. Inside, the ritual is instantly recognizable. The skin fade, the straight razor, ustura in Turkish, the scissors, Makas, moving quickly around the chair, the steaming hot towel pressed across the face, eyebrows threaded, fine hairs around the ears removed with a flash of flame, then perhaps a shoulder massage before you leave. It is not simply a haircut. As one Turkish barber in London explained,
girls service in Turkish coffee, Turkish tea, out the barbering, more like gentlemen's grooming.
And British men embraced it. At a time when traditional retail was disappearing from Britain's high streets, barber shops moved in. One report counted more than 3,000 new barber shops opening in just 5 years. The explanation seemed almost beautifully simple.
You can't have a haircut online.
Amazon could replace the bookshop. Online banking could replace the local branch. Streaming could replace the video store. But eventually, somebody still has to cut your hair. And Turkish immigrants arrived with a barbering culture that had spent generations turning that necessity into an experience. Few embody that story better than Şenol Erdoğan. Originally from Izmir, Şenol began cutting hair when he was just 9 years old. After coming to Britain and opening his first London shop, he says he worked 7 days a week for 5 years without taking a day off. Eventually, footballers began sitting in his chair. Rio Ferdinand became a client. Word spread. But Şenol says the real appeal of the Turkish barbershop is much simpler.
Exclusive. Our doors open to everyone. In waiting area, you can see teachers, lawyers, electricians, footballers, homeless, everybody equal here.
That may explain why something imported from Turkey became such a familiar part of everyday British life. But then the numbers kept growing and growing. Between 2014 and 2019, the number of barbershops in Britain reportedly increased from 7,958 to 13,048, a rise of 64%. Later estimates put the number at around 18,000, and in some places, people began asking a different question. How many barbers can one high street actually support? In Coventry, investigative journalist Sue Reed says her team discovered 22 barbershops on one street. Some, she said, lined up literally like soldiers. In Accrington, Lancashire, another investigation found 15 barbers on one main street. Then came something more serious: police raids, immigration enforcement, money laundering investigations, modern slavery concerns, and allegations that organized criminal networks were exploiting cash-intensive businesses across Britain's struggling high streets. But there is an important distinction. The words Turkish Barber above a shop do not necessarily tell you who owns it. Investigations have involved Albanian, Romanian, Bosnian, Serbian, and other operators using Turkish-style branding. And one journalist investigating suspicious barbershops made the distinction explicit.
Not every Turkish barbers is a front for organised crime. The problem that we've got is actually the legit ones are being run out of business by bad actors.
That distinction matters because behind the headlines are thousands of genuine barbers, immigrants who brought a craft with them, men like Şenol who worked 7 days a week. And somewhere along the way, their success became so recognizable that Turkish Barber became a British high street brand in its own right. Successful enough to imitate, successful enough to exploit. and widespread enough to attract the attention of police. But to understand what Britain imported, you have to see where the tradition came from. Recently, travel creator Nathan flew from Cape Town, South Africa to Istanbul and deliberately searched for what he called the real Turkish barber experience. He found a third-generation barber, grandfather, father, son. The barber even showed him clippers passed through the family.
Tradition. My father and grandfather, me business 3 generations. This machine, 16 years old.
60.
Yeah.
Wow.
My father used.
Then came the full ritual: steam, waxing, threading, hot towels, facial treatments, scalp conditioning, massage, and finally, the traditional splash of colonia. Nathan walked out calling it
Best haircut of my life. That's great. Full experience.
That is the tradition Britain imported. But what happened after it arrived is a distinctly British story. Tonight, we travel from the first Turkish barbers who brought their craft to Britain to the London shop that became famous among Premier League footballers, and into high streets where sometimes a dozen barbers now compete within walking distance. We'll ask why British men embraced them, how Turkish barbering flourished while other high street businesses disappeared, and why, behind some familiar red and white signs, investigators began finding a completely different story. This is the human map, because when people move, the map moves with them. Subscribe and explore the communities, cultures, and hidden networks quietly reshaping the world. But before the raids, the investigations, and the suspicions, there was simply a craft, and the immigrants who brought it to Britain. To understand why the Turkish barber conquered the British high street, you have to go back 6 centuries. During the Ottoman Empire, the barber was not simply a man with scissors. He was a craftsman, a social figure, and often a medical practitioner, performing wound dressing and minor procedures alongside haircuts and shaves. The barbershop was a community institution. Becoming a master required years of apprenticeship. Historical accounts describe temperament as part of the qualification. Someone who could not control his anger was considered unsuitable. The craft demanded character, not just skill. And that 600-year tradition did not disappear. It traveled. In Britain, the first major Turkish-speaking communities arrived through Turkish Cypriot migration in the 1950s and 1960s, settling particularly across North London, Green Lanes, Haringey, Wood Green, and Dalston. They brought their trades with them. By the 1980s and 1990s, migrants from mainland Turkey had joined them, along with Kurdish migrants from southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. And gradually, the words Turkish barber began appearing on British streets. What they offered was genuinely different. A conventional British barbershop might provide a haircut and shave. The Turkish experience turned that visit into something closer to a ritual. Skin fade, straight razor shave, hot towel, eyebrow threading, face treatment, head and shoulder massage, and perhaps most memorably, fire. A flaming cotton swab passed rapidly around the ears to singe away fine hairs. Mustafa Can, a Turkish barber in Swindon, explained the appeal. People like that it's traditional, that we burn the hairs out of the ears and nose, that we use a cutthroat razor and a hot towel. For roughly £15 to £25, customers could receive a collection of treatments that might cost considerably more individually somewhere else. The value proposition was difficult to ignore, and behind it was often something harder to reproduce: years of apprenticeship. Şenol Erdoğan, the barber king we met earlier, began cutting hair at just 9 years old. His first customer was his childhood best friend, Yeshum. Şenol remembers.
I cut my first haircut. I was 9 years old. He was my best friend, and I put his name on my arm. My first client, Yesham.
He later tattooed that first client's name onto his arm. That tells you something about the relationship many traditional barbers have with the craft. This was not necessarily a job discovered after arriving in Britain. For men like Şenol, it was a vocation learned young, refined through repetition, and carried across a border. And British customers noticed. So did British business. Beginning in 2008, fashion brand Ted Baker expanded into Turkish-style grooming shops in London, adopting elements of the aesthetic and experience immigrant barbers had already popularized. That was an extraordinary reversal. An immigrant service that initially had to find its place on the British high street had become successful enough for mainstream British brands to imitate it. Turkish barbering had not simply adapted to Britain. Britain had adapted to Turkish barbering. The hot towels were real. The craftsmanship was real. The demand was real. And the businesses multiplied because British customers genuinely wanted what they were selling. But eventually, the multiplication became difficult to explain through popularity alone. One shop became 3, 3 became 10, and on some British streets, 10 became 20. The success of the Turkish barber had created something enormously valuable, a trusted high street brand that almost anyone could put above a shop. And that is when a former Metropolitan Police officer, journalists, and eventually law enforcement began asking a very different question. How many barbers can one British high street actually support? Walk through almost any British town, and the pattern is difficult to miss. Not one Turkish barber, not 2, sometimes 5, 8, 12. On one main street in Coventry, investigators counted 22 barbershops. In Accrington, Lancashire, a town of roughly 35,000 people, journalists found 15 barbers on a single street. And in Hythe, Kent, population around 14,000, one local creator decided to walk the high street and count for himself. He began with a simple calculation.
Hythe has got a population of around 14,000. Now if you think about that, 7,000 men, males. And let's have a look, how many Turkish barbers can we find?
The question being asked across Britain was obvious. How could so many nearly identical businesses survive beside one another? Investigative journalist Zach Garner-Purkis looked more closely at Accrington. His team calculated how frequently local men would theoretically need haircuts for all those shops to survive. He described what they found.
Main streets in Accrington, they actually had 15 barbers. So we run the numbers on how many blokes would be needing to get their hair cut. We also found a massive shortfall.
That does not prove those businesses were doing anything illegal. Some may draw customers from surrounding areas. Some may have lower costs. Some may simply be competing in an oversaturated market. But the unusual density began attracting attention because barbering has another characteristic. It is traditionally cash-intensive. And for money laundering, cash-intensive service businesses can be useful. Consider the basic problem. If a clothing shop claims to sell 200 shirts every day, investigators can potentially compare those sales against inventory. Where are the shirts? Who supplied them? How many were purchased? But a barber sells a service. There is no haircut sitting on a shelf afterward. A criminal operator could theoretically mix illegal cash with legitimate takings and record customers who never existed. The barber shop itself does not create the criminal money. it can potentially make dirty money appear to have come from haircuts. And that concern became more serious when investigators started looking beyond the shop signs. One investigation found that the businesses operating under the familiar Turkish Barber label were not necessarily Turkish-owned at all. Some cases investigated by authorities have involved people from elsewhere in the Balkans and Eastern Europe using the Turkish Barber identity because British customers already recognize it. That distinction is crucial. The success described in Part 1 created a brand. But once the brand became valuable, you did not necessarily need to be Turkish or even trained in the Turkish barbering tradition to put those words above your door. And legitimate barbers could become victims of the same phenomenon. Garner Perkis recalled meeting one barber who said he needed around 10 haircuts per day to survive, but was getting only 5 or 6. Nearby, another barber appeared to have no customers. The first was preparing to close. That is where the story becomes more complicated. Because an ordinary barber depends on customers. He needs enough haircuts to pay the rent, enough returning clients to pay employees, enough profit to keep the lights on. But if a business is being used primarily for another purpose, normal competition may matter less. And British authorities were no longer looking only at suspicious financial patterns. They were investigating illegal employment, modern slavery, human trafficking, and organized crime connected to some cash-intensive businesses, including some barber shops. Again, this was not the Turkish barber industry as a whole. Thousands were doing exactly what Şenol had done, cutting hair, working long hours, and building legitimate businesses. But the very success of the industry had created camouflage. A shop that looked completely ordinary from the pavement could be exactly that, an ordinary barber. Or it could be something else. And in one English town, police walked through a barber shop, went past the mirrors and chairs, found a staircase, and discovered what was hidden underneath.
In Haverhill, Suffolk, police entered what looked like an ordinary high street barber shop. Mirrors, barber chairs, hair products, nothing particularly unusual from the pavement. But officers continued through the premises. Behind the public-facing shop, they found stairs leading down into the basement. And there, according to reporting from a police operation, they discovered evidence that someone had apparently been living beneath the business in extremely poor conditions. The raid was part of something much larger. In 2025, authorities launched Operation Machinize, a nationwide crackdown targeting high street businesses suspected of links to criminal activity. And importantly, it was not an operation against Turkish barbers specifically. Police targeted a range of cash-intensive businesses, including barbershops, vape shops, car washes, mini-markets, and other premises, where authorities suspected offenses ranging from money laundering and illegal working to drug crime and modern slavery. Across the operation, thousands of businesses were visited, hundreds of people were arrested, and millions of pounds in suspected criminal assets were seized. The concern was no longer simply that there seemed to be too many barbers. Investigators were asking what might be happening behind some of the storefronts. In Oxford, GB News accompanied immigration enforcement officers during a raid on a barbershop suspected of employing people illegally. The shop's owner was Albanian. One worker, a Colombian asylum seeker, was detained for allegedly working in breach of immigration restrictions. Reporter Mark White explained,
Today, GB News was given exclusive access on a raid in Oxford where the Minister for Illegal Immigration joined enforcement officers targeting a barber's shop suspected of employing foreign nationals illegally.
Again, the nationality matters. A shop can advertise itself as a Turkish barber without the owner being Turkish. The sign describes a style of grooming. It does not necessarily describe the people behind the business. And the investigations extended beyond illegal employment. the National Crime Agency has warned about criminal groups exploiting legitimate-looking high street businesses for money laundering, migrant smuggling, labor exploitation, and other organized crime. One case involved a barbershop owner in Colindale, London, arrested during an NCA investigation into recruiting lorry drivers to smuggle migrants into Britain from northern France and Belgium. Other investigations have raised concerns about debt bondage, migrants arriving owing smugglers large sums of money, then being forced to work to repay those debts. A haircut can therefore be the visible business. The real exploitation, in some cases, may be happening somewhere else entirely. But this is exactly where the story requires caution. A police raid on one shop does not tell you anything about the barber next door. A suspicious business model does not make an entire industry suspicious. And a Turkish sign does not make the owner Turkish. Investigative journalist Zach Garner-Perkis, after spending months examining the issue, made that distinction explicit.
The point should be is not every Turkish barbers is a front for organised crime. The problem that we've got is actually the legit ones are being run out of business by bad actors.
That may be the most important sentence in this entire section, because legitimate Turkish barbers have something to lose from these allegations too. Their reputation, their customers, and potentially the businesses they spent years building. For someone like Şenol Erdoğan, who worked 7 days a week for 5 years, the idea that the words Turkish barber could become shorthand for criminality erases the very immigrant story that made the brand successful. The two stories exist, but they are not the same story. One is about a centuries-old craft carried into Britain and turned into a successful high street business. The other is about criminal networks allegedly discovering that a trusted, cash-intensive business model could sometimes provide useful cover. And ironically, the people with perhaps the greatest interest in separating those two stories are the genuine Turkish barbers themselves. Because as suspicion spread across Britain's high streets, they began pushing back.
For legitimate Turkish barbers, the suspicion has created a strange problem. They built a brand so successful that other people began using it. And now, some of the people who created that reputation are having to defend it. When Nigel Farage publicly questioned the extraordinary growth of Turkish barbershops in Britain, G11 Barbers in Glasgow responded, not with a press release, but with art. Working with street artist Rebel Bear, they installed 13 photographs of Farage across their shop front window. Farage with an afro, Farage with a mullet, Farage with curtains. Their message was simple. Come and see what an actual Turkish barbershop looks like. See the customers, see the barbers working. See what an actual Turkish barbershop looks like, before treating an entire industry as suspicious. That response matters because behind the headlines are thousands of ordinary businesses doing something much less mysterious: cutting hair. For Şenol Erdoğan, that meant starting with almost nothing and working relentlessly. When he opened his first shop in London, he says he worked 7 days a week for 5 consecutive years, sometimes keeping the doors open until midnight. His father had given him advice that stayed with him.
My dad always said to me, "Sen işten korkma, iş senden korksun."
Şenol, do not be afraid of work. Eventually, that work produced something he could never have predicted. Former England defender Rio Ferdinand sat in his chair. Şenol fixed his beard. Ferdinand shared the result on Instagram. Then other footballers started calling. Premier League players, international clients, and the Turkish immigrant who began cutting his friend's hair at 9 years old became known as the Barber King. But celebrity clients are not really what explains the Turkish barber's success. The ordinary customer does. the teacher, the electrician, the delivery driver, the teenager getting his first skin fade, the pensioner coming in for the same haircut every few weeks. And that helps explain why barbershops expanded while so much of the traditional British high street contracted. A bank can move on to an app, a travel agency can move online, clothing can arrive tomorrow morning from a warehouse. But you cannot download a haircut. You cannot have Amazon deliver a hot towel. You cannot ask an algorithm to thread your eyebrows. And you certainly cannot have a website singe the hair from your ears with a flame. The Turkish barber combined that physical necessity with something the internet is particularly bad at reproducing: human interaction. Tea, conversation, familiar faces. A barber who remembers how you like your fade. A waiting room where, as Şenol says, a footballer might sit beside an electrician and nobody receives special treatment. That social function is older than Britain itself. It goes back to the Ottoman barbershops, where men gathered not simply to groom themselves, but to talk, exchange news, and spend time together. The surroundings changed, the function survived. And this is why reducing Britain's Turkish barbers to the criminal investigations surrounding some high street businesses misses the larger story. The genuine phenomenon came first. The demand came first. The craft came first. The criminal exploitation followed precisely because the business had become so familiar. Turkish Barber had become a recognizable British brand. And perhaps that is the strangest measure of its success. A tradition carried from Turkey became so thoroughly embedded in Britain that it could be copied by people with no connection to Turkey at all. The barber pole stayed. The hot towel stayed. The Turkish flag sometimes stayed. But the meaning of the sign became harder to read. Which leaves Britain with two very different stories hiding beneath the same words. And to understand what the Turkish barber takeover really means, we have to separate them. A craft that began generations ago in Turkey has become part of everyday British life. Makas, ustura, hot towels, fire, conversation. For thousands of legitimate barbers, that familiar ritual represents years of training, long working days, immigrant ambition, and businesses built one customer at a time. But success created something else, a brand worth copying. And when criminal networks began exploiting some cash-heavy businesses, the Turkish barber sign acquired a suspicion its genuine practitioners never asked for. The challenge is separating those two stories without confusing one for the other. So what do you think explains Britain's extraordinary barber boom? A better service? Immigrant entrepreneurship? An oversaturated industry? Or is there more happening beneath the surface? Tell us in the comments. This is the Human Map.